Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I have a quick video to share with you today about creating some quick and easy faux watercoloring cards. This is an easy, kind of messy look watercolor technique, but with stamping. I will be sharing two cards today with a slight variation in technique for both. And for both of the cards, I'm going to be using the Pretty Pink Posh Wild Rose stamp and die set. I'll be using my Misty for this technique, but you can certainly use an acrylic block just as easily. I've started by placing a piece of Tim Holtz Distress watercolor cardstock into my Misty, and here I'm just arranging the stamps as close as I possibly can into a cluster onto my cardstock. I'm using my Distress inks because they're so great at reacting with water, and this will give me some good results of a watercolor look that I'm going for. After I ink up the stamp with my Distress inks, I'll spray the stamp several times with water, and then when I close the door of my Misty, all of that ink transfers to my paper. Now you can add as much or as little water as you want to, but for this first panel I did use minimal water, and so my colors didn't move around a whole bunch. However, for my second panel, I'm going to be adding more water, and that water will cause those inks to bleed into each other and move around quite a bit. So after cleaning off the stamp, I'm again inking up the stamps using a different color of combination of Distress inks. Here I'm using a dauber just to get into those tiny leaf spaces. And for the second panel, I'm going to add a whole bunch of water to get more of the messy water look. I've sprayed these stamps several times with water, and then I will go in and spray the watercolor cardstock several times. And here, once I close the door of my Misty, all of that ink transferred onto my panel. So I wanted more of a watercolor look for this one, so I spritzed it again, and then closed the door to my Misty to transfer more ink. Here you can see the difference between the amount of watercolor between the first and the second panel, and really the difference is just in the amount of the water that I added. I like to set my panels aside and let them air dry, and then I can come in to create my cards. For this first card, I thought it would be a nice contrast between the watercolor background and the hand-painted florals, or what looks like to be hand-painted florals. So I'm just coming in and painting the background using Distress ink and cracked pistachio. I have it smushed onto a piece of acetate off to the side, and then I can just come in and loosely paint around the flowers, being careful not to pick up any of that pink and smear it into my background. Once again, I'll let the panel air dry, and then I'm using one of the Hero Arts rectangle dies to die cut the panel where the florals are kind of in the center. To finish this panel, I'm stamping a large and bold sentiment across the panel by using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I do have to stamp it out a couple of times because of the texture of the watercolor paper. Next, I'll add my black embossing powder and melt it with my heat gun to set it in place. To finish this card off, I've cut a piece of black and white pattern paper by MFT down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I've adhered it to a top folding A2 sized white card base. Next, I've trimmed a piece of fun foam, and I'm going to add it to the back of the watercolor panel to create a little dimension. And lastly, I'm going to add some Ranger enamel accents in black, and as careful as I am applying them to my card panel, before I put this card away to dry, I stuck my finger in there and smeared one of the dots. However, I did fix it just by letting these dots dry and then carefully scraping them off with my craft knife and adhering some regular enamel dots over that space. For this second panel, I'm going to stamp out the outline of the images, and that was the reason why I had left them in place after doing the watercoloring technique. So now I can just easily add my black ink and then stamp them down the outline of these roses. Now, I had this panel from a different project that I had ink blended Salty Ocean Distress ink, and then I've created some texture by spritzing the panel with water and blotting it dry. And then I'm still creating a little more texture by splattering the panel with some watered down white acrylic paint. And for a little bit more contrast, I'm coming in with black watered down acrylic paint. While the ink blended panel dries off to the side, I'm creating an oval frame using the Hero Arts Oval Infinity dies. And I have 2 dies that I'll be using placed on a piece of magnet, and then once I align it, I can go ahead and secure it with some tape so that it does not shift on me while I'm die cutting. I'm using this black shimmery cardstock that I happen to have in my stash from an old Hero Arts kit. And while I have those dies in place, I will also die cut the frame from several pieces of black cardstock. I'm just using my Zig 2-way glue pen and just adding the glue to one side of the frame, and then I'm stacking it on top of the other. So here I have all of my components kind of arranged on the panel, and this will help me place the sentiment. I'm using a rather large sentiment by scrapbook.com on the inside of the oval frame. And I am using my MISTI to help me stamp that out and align it straight. I'm treating the panel with anti-static powder to remove any static. And then I can add my Versamark ink to my stamp and stamp that down onto my panel, and then I can add some black embossing powder to the stamp sentiment. I just funnel the excess back into the container, and I can use my heat tool to heat set the embossing powder in place. At this point, I'm ready to start adhering all of the components to my card front. I have the ink blended panel adhered to an A2 sized top folding white card base, and I've added the oval frame using liquid adhesive. Next, I'm going to add some dimensional foam squares to the back of the floral images so that it kind of evenly sits on the frame, and add those in place. I tried real hard to add all of those 4 flowers, but it just was not going to happen. It looked too clustered with 4 images, so I will just save that little lone flower for another project. I also had the die cut leaves that I've added in place, and I think the contrast of all those colors goes so well with the ink blended background. And then finally, just to add a little bit of embellishing to my card, I'm grabbing the Studio Katya Mix 1 clear drops, and I'm going to adhere them randomly on my finished panel. And that will finish up my cards for today. If you've enjoyed this project, be sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. I'll have some close-up pictures as well as all of the supplies I used for these cards on my blog, which I will link to down below if you're interested in checking that out. As always, thank you so much for stopping by, and I will see you next time.